They drag you down the narrow corridor, torches flickering on damp stone walls, the stench of mold and human decay clinging to the air like a living thing. Every step echoes louder than the last, not because of the iron shackles biting into your ankles, but because you already know where this road ends. At the bottom, in the dark, the dungeon. This is not the world of castles and chivalry that storybooks promised. This is the other side of the Middle Ages, the side no bard sang about, the side kings never wanted their peasants to imagine. The dungeon was not a place of justice, nor of order. It was a slow death sentence carved in stone. Prisoners didn't walk into those cells as men and walk out as men. They went in as human beings and came out, if they ever came out at all, as broken shadows, their bodies carved by torture and their minds hollowed out by despair. And tonight, we descend into that darkness. Picture it. The year is 1348. Europe trembles under plague, famine, and war. In towns and villages, fear spreads faster than rats through grain sacks. A whisper against the crown, a crime of hunger, or simply being born into the wrong family could condemn you. And once accused, there was no trial like we know today. The courtroom was not a place for truth. It was a stage for power. And when that gavel of power fell, men were not taken to correctional centers. They were dragged into the belly of the castle. The dungeon was not designed for living. It was designed for waiting. Waiting for death, waiting for punishment, waiting for confession. And if you would not confess, the dungeon would make you. The descent began with sound. The grinding of iron hinges, the slam of oak doors reinforced with blackened nails. Guards pushing you forward, their faces indifferent. They'd seen this before. They'd watched countless men vanish into the stone throat of the earth, and they knew most would never come back. The steps spiraled downward, colder with each turn. Torches hissed against the damp. And then, the final door. Thick, heavy. A gate not just of wood and iron, but of fate. Once it closed, sunlight was gone forever. Inside, the dungeon stretched like a tomb. Walls oozed with moisture. The air stank of filth, excrement, and rot. Chains hung from hooks like idle serpents, waiting for flesh. A prisoner's world shrank to a single slab of stone or, in many cases, no slab at all. You were left on the floor, sharing space with rats fattened on human misery. Here, food was not nourishment. It was punishment. A crust of stale bread, hard enough to break teeth. A bowl of watery gruel alive with worms. And if you were lucky, water collected from the same gutter that carried waste down the walls. The body withered in weeks. First came hunger's dull ache, then weakness so heavy you could not rise even when a rat nipped your toes. But hunger was mercy compared to what else awaited, because the dungeon was never only about holding prisoners, it was about breaking them. Torture was not the exception. It was the rule. The rack, its wooden frame waiting to stretch bone from socket. The Iron Maiden, its spikes promising an embrace that would last forever. The strappado, a rope that dislocated shoulders before it broke spirit. And the wheel, which turned men into nothing more than shattered heaps of flesh. And yet, perhaps worse than the torture itself was the silence between. The endless hours where the only sound was your own breathing, your own heartbeat echoing against the stone, wondering if tonight would be the night they came for you. In the dark, the mind unraveled. Some screamed until their voices broke. Others whispered prayers that went unanswered. And many simply sat in silence, staring into the void, until madness felt like the only escape. But here's the cruelest truth of all. Not every prisoner was guilty. Some were thieves, yes. Some were traitors, rebels, or soldiers captured in war. But many were peasants caught in the gears of power. Accused because someone hungered for their land. Condemned because they could not pay a debt. Or simply punished because a lord's anger demanded blood. And so, the dungeon became not only a chamber of punishment, but of injustice. A place where power fed on the powerless. Now imagine yourself there, shackled to stone, your hands raw from iron, the cold gnawing at your bones. each day bleeding into the next until you no longer know if it is morning or night. The guards never tell you. They simply open the door when it's time for pain. And you wonder, how long can a human survive this? How long until the body gives out? How long until the mind collapses under the weight of darkness? But the dungeon was not merciful. It had no schedule, no rhythm, no logic. Time meant nothing. The torment could come in minutes or weeks. That uncertainty was its own weapon, gnawing at hope until hope no longer existed. This was life in a medieval dungeon. Not just punishment of the body, but annihilation of the soul. And yet we've only scratched the surface of what these stone walls held. The dungeon did not kill you quickly. That would have been too merciful. It killed you slowly, piece by piece, until you were nothing but a husk. The first thing stripped away was time. Days and nights bled together in the dark. Torches only lit when guards chose, leaving you unsure if you'd been trapped for a week or a year. Prisoners spoke of counting their own heartbeats, of scratching lines into stone walls, only to lose track when madness crept in and the lines began to blur. The second thing stolen was dignity. You lived where you sat, and you sat where you defecated. The stench was constant, unbearable, a mix of rot, waste, and damp stone. Rats thrived in it. Big, black rats that did not fear men, because here, men were too weak to resist. They gnawed at scraps of bread, scraps of corpses, sometimes scraps of the living. Prisoners learned to sleep with knees curled tight to chest, trying to protect feet and hands from hungry teeth. And then, the food, or what passed as food. Thin porridge made from barley husks and water. Bread as hard as rock, sometimes moldy, sometimes crawling with insects. Some refused to eat it at first, gagging at the taste. But hunger was a sharper master than pride. Within days, you devoured whatever was thrown into the cell, even when it smelled foul, even when worms writhed inside. Water came from buckets filled at the same wells that carried waste, thick with disease. Dysentery was common. Fevers swept through the darkness like wildfires, burning through entire groups of prisoners until the cells stank not just of filth, but of sickness and death. But disease was still not the worst fate. Torture awaited those who resisted, those who refused confession, or those whose captors simply wanted sport. The most infamous device was the rack. A simple wooden frame with rollers at each end, ropes binding wrists and ankles. At first, the turning was slow, almost gentle, pulling joints apart. But the more you screamed, the more they turned. Shoulders dislocated, muscles tore, bones cracked. And if you fainted, they doused you with cold water, forcing you back into agony. Few left the rack with their bodies intact. Many left unable to walk again. Another horror was the strappado. The victims' hands were bound behind their back, a rope tied to the wrists, then hoisted high so that the entire weight of the body hung by the shoulders. The pain was instant, unbearable. Arms twisted unnaturally, shoulders ripped from their sockets. Some were left to dangle for hours, swinging like broken dolls, until they confessed to anything, whether true or false, just to be cut down. And then there was the wheel. Prisoners stretched across a cartwheel, limbs spread wide, while hammers shattered bones one by one. The body was left twisted, broken, sometimes displayed as a warning to others. Not all torture was designed to kill. Much of it was designed to keep you alive just enough to suffer again tomorrow. The dungeon was not just physical torment. It was psychological war. Guards sometimes whispered lies into cells, telling prisoners their families had abandoned them, their wives remarried, their children dead. They spread rumors that executions were scheduled, even when none were. Hope flickered like a candle, snuffed out at random, leaving only despair. Some prisoners broke quickly, confessing within hours. Others clung stubbornly to silence, but silence rarely lasted long. Sleep deprivation was one of the cruelest tools. Prisoners were kept awake for days. Buckets of cold water poured over their heads, whips cracking at their backs whenever they closed their eyes. Hallucinations came next. Visions of loved ones, phantom voices in the dark. By then, confession wasn't even coerced. It spilled out like delirium. And for those who refused even then, worse waited. Rats were not only companions in the dungeon, they were weapons. One infamous torture involved placing a cage filled with rats against a prisoner's stomach or chest, the open side pressed to the skin. A heated plate was placed on the other side of the cage, and as the rats panicked from the heat, they dug the only way they could, through flesh, through muscle, into the body itself. Prisoners screamed until their voices tore, sometimes dying before the rats ever stopped. But sometimes, the cruelest torture needed no devices. Solitary confinement in a pitch-black hole beneath the dungeon broke men faster than whips. Imagine complete darkness. No sound but your own breathing. No room to stand. Just a pit of cold stone. The air thick and stale. Hours became days. Days became madness. Prisoners clawed at walls, at their own skin, desperate for any sensation to remind them they were still alive. And through all of this, there was one unspoken rule. No one cared if you lived or died. Guards did not check for your pulse. If you lay still for too long, rats and disease would finish you, and your body would be hauled out only when the stench grew unbearable. For many, execution was not the horror. It was the release. The gallows, the axe, even the pyre were mercies compared to the endless torment of stone walls. Prisoners begged for death. They prayed for it. And some took it into their own hands, using belts, chains, or even their own teeth to rip veins open just to end the nightmare. But the dungeon had a way of making even death uncertain. Some prisoners were left to rot after execution, their corpses displayed as warnings. Others were half buried in shallow pits within the dungeon itself, their bones mingling with the living until no one could tell where one man's suffering ended and another's began. The dungeon was not simply a prison, it was a machine of fear. And fear was the most powerful weapon in the medieval world. Because word of what happened inside those walls traveled fast. Villagers whispered about the screams that echoed from castles at night. Soldiers feared capture more than death on the battlefield. And peasants obeyed their lords not only from duty, but because they knew the alternative was a descent into the dungeon's hell. And yet, the most haunting part of this story isn't the torture, or the starvation, or even the rats. It's the silence of the forgotten. Countless prisoners were locked away, never to be seen again. No records, no names, no graves, just bones swallowed by stone. And if you listen closely, some say those walls still hold their echoes. The dungeon destroyed the body, but its sharpest blade was reserved for the mind. At first, most prisoners tried to endure. They whispered prayers in the dark, clung to memories of family, of sunlight, of laughter once shared in open fields. But stone is a cruel companion. It does not answer. It does not comfort. It waits, and it breaks you. Isolation gnawed more savagely than hunger. Prisoners spoke to themselves, inventing voices to keep them company. Some scratched names into the walls, repeating them endlessly, terrified they might forget who they were. Others sang until their voices cracked, clinging to rhythm as if song could anchor them to sanity. But sanity was fragile. The endless dark became a theater of hallucinations. Shapes shifted in torchlight. Shadows became men. Rats became whispers. Some prisoners swore they saw their loved ones standing in the cell, reaching out with gentle hands. They cried, called out, only to wake and realize the vision was nothing but the trick of a mind unraveling. And then came the nightmares. Dreams where the rack turned endlessly, where chains melted into skin, where voices begged from the walls. Dreams that felt more real than waking. Some prisoners begged not for release, but simply for sleep without dreams. By the time months passed, if they survived that long, many no longer remembered their own names. They rocked in corners like children, eyes glazed, voices reduced to murmurs. The dungeon did not need executioners to end them. It erased their very humanity. Yet among these shadows, a few stories slipped through the cracks of history. Survivors. Men and women who endured the dungeon long enough to be released, or exchanged, or ransomed. their words carry the weight of the nightmare. Take the story of Jean de Carouge, a French knight imprisoned in the late 14th century. He wrote of cells so damp that mushrooms grew on the walls, and of prisoners chained so tightly they could not lie down. When he was finally released, he spoke of how silence had been the most unbearable of all, that he would rather face the sword than return to the pit, or consider the fate of the Tower of London's captives. Its dungeons were infamous for the rack and the scavenger's daughter, a twisted iron frame that compressed the body until blood poured from nose and ears. Some prisoners confessed simply at the sight of it, but the tower also held another weapon: waiting. Prisoners spent years beneath its stones, forgotten, until they begged for death. Even the Inquisition perfected the art of dungeon suffering. In Spain and Italy, inquisitors locked men in cells so narrow they could not stretch their arms, feeding them through holes no larger than a rat's path. Some of these cells still exist, hidden in the basements of old churches, their walls scratched with desperate prayers. But perhaps the most chilling legacy is not in written records. It is in the bones unearthed centuries later. Archaeologists have opened collapsed dungeons in castles across Europe, finding skeletons shackled to walls, skulls fractured, spines twisted unnaturally. In one German fortress, entire piles of bones were found beneath the floor, prisoners buried where they died, their existence erased until the earth itself revealed their suffering. And still the stories linger. Legends whisper of the oubliette, the forgotten place, a dungeon designed not with rooms or doors, but with a single vertical shaft. Prisoners were thrown in, the opening sealed, leaving them to starve in the dark with no escape. Some shafts were so narrow that the prisoner could not even sit, forced to stand until their legs gave out. The French name itself tells the truth: oubliette, from oublier, to forget. And that was the essence of the dungeon: forgetting. Not just the forgetting of law or mercy, but the deliberate erasure of human beings. Lords and kings could silence voices by simply locking them away until nothing remained but dust. But the strangest part of all is how normalized it was. To us it feels monstrous, to them it was order, justice, a tool of control. And so the screams that echoed through castle walls were not cries of injustice, they were reminders, warnings, lessons whispered into the night: obey, or this will be your fate. Yet still, humanity flickered. Even here, stories tell of prisoners who carved crosses into stone, holding on to faith even as their bodies wasted. Some scratched poetry into the walls, verses about love and freedom, desperate to leave something behind in case anyone, someday, found them. A few even survived long enough to be freed, stepping out into daylight so blinded that the sun itself felt like fire. But freedom was not always mercy. Survivors often carried scars deeper than flesh. Bodies twisted, arms useless, legs lame, minds fractured, haunted by screams and shadows. They walked out of the dungeon alive, but part of them never truly left. And centuries later, when we look back at the castles, the fortresses, the grand monuments of medieval Europe, it is easy to admire their beauty. Their towers scrape the sky. Their halls echo with grandeur. But beneath those stone floors, in the hidden chambers where sunlight never reached, another truth lies buried. A truth of iron and chains, of screams and silence, of men and women swallowed by darkness. The horrifying life of a prisoner in a medieval dungeon was not just a punishment. It was erasure. Erasure of body, of mind, of name, of existence. And in that erasure lies the darkest reflection of humanity's hunger for control. Because the dungeon was never truly about crime. It was about fear. And fear, in the medieval world, was the strongest chain of all. Centuries have passed since the last cries of medieval prisoners echoed in those stone chambers. The castles that once held them now stand as monuments of history, their towers piercing the sky, their halls filled with tourists and laughter. But beneath the polished stone, beneath the flags and the gift shops, the dungeons remain, silent, waiting. Step into one today, and the air is still heavy, colder than the rooms above. Your footsteps sound too loud, as if you're disturbing something that does not wish to be disturbed. The walls are scarred with scratches, crude markings carved by desperate hands that refuse to vanish without leaving a trace. Numbers, crosses, words so faint you can barely read them. Messages from the forgotten. Some say if you stand in those chambers long enough, you'll hear whispers. Not the creak of stone or the drip of water, but voices, broken prayers, shattered sobs, screams too faint for the ear, but sharp enough for the soul. Legends claim that ghosts still linger there. Not the kind that haunt with rattling chains, but the kind that live in memory, in the weight of what was done. Because how could such suffering not leave scars? Even now, historians and archaeologists debate the true horrors of the medieval dungeon. Some claim the stories are exaggerated, made larger by time and fear. Others point to bones unearthed, shackles rusted into walls, torture devices preserved in museums, and argue that no exaggeration could ever match the reality. And maybe that is the most haunting truth of all. We will never know the full scale of what happened. Too many voices silenced, too many names erased, too many stories swallowed by stone. But what we do know is this: the dungeon was not a place of justice. It was a weapon, a system designed not only to punish but to terrify. It showed people what could happen if they stepped out of line. And in that way, its power extended far beyond the chains. It reached into every village, every home, every heart. Think about it. A farmer hears of a neighbor dragged into the dungeon and never seen again. A soldier returns from battle with stories of comrades taken by the enemy, tortured beneath their castles. A child grows up hearing whispers of the oubliette, the pit of no return. Fear spreads like fire. Fear governs more tightly than any sword, and the dungeon was its furnace. And yet, the dungeon did not vanish with the Middle Ages. Its echoes stretch into modern prisons, into interrogation chambers, into black sites hidden from the world's eyes. Humanity learned long ago how to break the body. What has changed, perhaps, is only how we hide it. Walk into a medieval dungeon today, and you may see only stone, rust, and shadow. But look closer. Listen harder. Imagine the man who once sat where you stand now, chained and shivering, his stomach gnawing with hunger, his ears filled with silence too loud to bear. Imagine his prayers, his last thoughts before the darkness swallowed him. He is gone, his name forgotten, but the walls remember, and that is the true horror of the medieval dungeon. Not just the torture, not just the starvation, not even the rats. It is the forgetting, the deliberate erasure of human lives, lives reduced to echoes in stone. So the next time you see a castle standing proud against the horizon, don't just marvel at the towers or the banners flying in the wind. Remember what lies beneath. Remember the dungeons. Remember the men and women whose suffering is carved invisibly into those stones. Because history often shows us its glory, but it is in the shadows, in the silence of forgotten cells, that we find its truth. And perhaps that truth is the most terrifying of all.